Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you for this invitation. I'm thrilled. As we are coming back after lunch, and one of the speakers has asked me, who's coming to this conference? And I said, what kind of profiles? And I said, well, from the list I can make assumptions. So I shared what I think. But as an exercise overcoming the lunch tip, I want to ask you to raise your hands if you feel identified with the number of groups that we made, simply to know a little bit, to identify the diversity in the group. These groups are very artificial, but just for the sake. So, for example, if you feel if you're a student, can you raise your hand? Yes. Okay. Yes, great. If you feel you're working for a civil society organization, if you identify as a civil society organization, okay. We can have multiple identities. We can be, for sure, students and working for a civil society. Anyone working for a national government, public official? National. Local government. Some. Yes. International organizations. Some. So you see, it's a diverse group. Also, we make assumptions about where we come from, but this is the richness. And it was the richness this morning. It has its beauties because we can enrich the discussions, and it has its challenges because it might take time for us to, come to converging on some ideas. I want to thank everyone who contributed some ideas to the posters. I think we have had limited time, but a few things were quite interesting. For example, on the vision for Europe, cooperation, a strengthening of multilateral diplomacy, investment, trust building. These are issues that came up in the morning and that were highlighted and came back in the post-its. And already a nice comment that warmed my heart was that we are already building trust and dialogue among our countries, signed by two people, one from Russia, one from Ukraine. So, we must find the spaces through the cracks to build a dialogue. Values of solidarity, diversity, respect, justice. We talked about values this morning, and this is also important to come back to those values and see how much they are guiding our work. On forces, we talk about positive narratives of the work of UN and EU and the work of civil society and peace movements. I'm summarizing just to get how these ideas are also coming back through the post-its. And the risks, quite a few, not so many post-its, if I have to say. So it's good that mostly the positive wishes were mentioned more than the risks. But the two that were mentioned were securitization, militarization, fears, bias, and double standards. So there are those risks as well. So thank you very much. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to this panel. Marjus will start. He's a member of the International Steering Group of the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. It's a youth-led peace network. Also president and co-founder of Sustainable Cooperation for Peace and Security, working on the Youth Peace and Security Agenda and the Women Peace and Security Agenda, and was part of Young Mediterranean Voices for Italy. Then second, we'll have Serge, STROOBANTS, Director for Europe and the MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And last but not least, we'll have Alessandra Morelli, who was a senior UN official working for UNHCR with more than 30 years of experience in high-risk environments, working on issues like counterterrorism in various contexts, such as Sahel, Horn of Africa. She told me she's retired, but I don't believe her. Because there's a lot of work that she's still doing. And the title of this panel is A Vision for Peace in Europe. And this morning we talked about analyzing the different realities and about learning from what has been tried or what has been done. So I think we need to root our thinking in understanding the history, the lessons learned, but at the same time be daring to explore and imagine new possibilities. And in peace education, I come from a peace education background. This is one of the skills that we are least trained on, to imagine and to dare to explore and believe and trust. So without further ado, I give the floor to Marjus for your intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here and for having organized such a great conference. First of all, I'm really happy and glad to see so many young faces and so many young fellows. So this is something that makes me proud to see like young people that are interested in the peace building field. I'll tackle basically my intervention. I have divided my intervention in three main areas. Peace in Europe and beyond Europe at political level, at the economical level, and health level. But I'm not going to talk about economical and health level because I'm not an expert on that field. And generally, when I have to give a speech alone without like interventions, I'm used to talk about topics that I don't know, but we'll have interventions and you'll find out that I'm not expert on these topics if I go along on this, on the field that I mentioned before. So, first of all, I'm Italian of second generation, son of Albanian immigrants, and I will tackle my intervention mentioning the Western Balkans in general. So I'm not going to go in details because it will look biased, my intervention having Albanian heritage, and there is no one that can rebut me. And so it doesn't look so fair. Second, as Young Mediterranean Voices Italy, I have worked like for more than 4 years in the field of connecting the two shores of the Mediterranean. So I'll give you some perspectives on my personal experience, how it worked, to give also hope and courage to other young people that want to take the same way and want to tackle the peace building field in that direction, to go in that field. So basically, how I see peace in Europe and beyond Europe. First of all, I'm not going to talk about negative peace, that is the absence of war, because we already talked about it in the morning, and I'm not going to tackle the Ukrainian and Russian war, because it's not my field, and we already talked about it, as I mentioned. I'm not going to read the definition of positive peace, because as you are interested in peace building, I think everyone knows. And to tell the truth, I have copied it from the International Institute for Economics and Peace. That's the definition. They have a great definition. So, first of all, when I have to talk about like how the Western Balkans are seen, I would use a word that psychiatrists use. It's like schizophrenic. Are the Western Balkans in or are they out? They basically are surrounded by countries that are members of the European Union. So they're totally surrounded. But at the same time, they are not part of the Union. And it's been almost 3 decades that they are waiting to join the Union. And so it's like a stressful process. And the Union is also losing a bit of appeal in the Western Balkans. Before, around 80–90% of the people were pro-joining the European Union. Even the most pro-European Union countries, the Albania and Kosovo, are decreasing their appeal to join the Union. So this is one direction. Basically, here you see 6 countries. And in the past, there were only 2 countries between the 6 that you see. It's like Albania, one country. It was former Yugoslavia, but not complete because we were missing Croatia and Slovenia that are already part of the Union. In Balkans, things goes really slowly. It took 30 years to have an agreement between Greece and North Macedonia on the name. The dispute was about the name of North Macedonia. After 30 years, they decided that it can be called North Macedonia. Before it was called FYROM, Federal Ex-Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. So you can understand that things there go slowly and has to be handled a bit with care. And I have been working 1 year in Serbia with this Italian Civilian Peace Corps, that is an Italian state youth program for young peace builders. And I've been 1 year also in Albania working for the integration of the Roma community. I was with another Italian state program. And here it comes, like why I connect the dots with youth peace building. So I've done these 2 youth programs by the Italian state. And I'm also a member of the International Steering Group of the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. Basically, to the Young Mediterranean Voices program, that is a program of the Anna Lindh Foundation, I worked in connecting the two shores of the Mediterranean. So basically, my work as a peace builder goes in two directions: the Western Balkans in Europe, and the northern shore of the Mediterranean, so Europe, and the southern shore of the Mediterranean, that is North Africa and Middle East. The Mediterranean Sea at the moment is seen as a cemetery, where people come for hope in Europe, but they die crossing the sea. And my role as Young Mediterranean Voices was to connect with other leaders, young leaders, from the other shore of the Mediterranean, and to come together to advocate to policymakers for youth causes. Here is the Mediterranean Sea, an image that I have taken from the artificial intelligence, basically. So if you see a cool PowerPoint, it's because I used the artificial intelligence. I don't have that many graphic skills. So basically, the Young Mediterranean Voices program before was called Young Arab Voices. And it was created to build a bridge between young people in the Arab countries during the Arab Spring, because it was a great gap between young people and policymakers. So this program was created in 2011 to build this bridge, to come together between young people and policymakers, so young people can raise their voice on the issues. And in 2014, Federica Mogherini, that was the High Representative, decided that the program should be expanded also to Europe. And from Young Arab Voices, it became Young Mediterranean Voices. And there I came in place, because after a few years I became Young Mediterranean Voices Italy, and I started my advocacy work, advocating for youth causes around the Euro-Mediterranean region. So, for the first time, in December 9, 2015, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution that recognized young people as positive agents of peace. That is the resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. And basically, my work at the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, and also as Young Mediterranean Voices Italy, was to advocate for this resolution. I was only 27 years old when I was giving speeches with President of Republics. The person that you see there is Your Excellency George Vella, the President of the Republic of Malta. It was my first time going to give a high-level speech with a high-level person. And I was almost passing out during the half of my speech. And the speech was only 3 minutes long. So basically, when you do this kind of advocacy work, you have 2 to 3 minutes. So you have to be really sharp on the points. So going with 1 or 2 points and describe them. You can't go broader, because no one will listen to what you're saying and they will miss it. In fact, do you think that he replied with a long sentence? No, it was 10 seconds. But it was enough to understand that I had done a great speech. And I'm not going to tackle the other, the other perspectives that I mentioned before, like peace beyond Europe, because I think we'll have time to exchange about it, because I think also that United Nations have a critical role, especially during these times when it comes to peace. Because what is the role that the Security Council can play now? Is it still updated or outdated? We have India, that is the biggest country in the world by population right now, but they are not member of the Security Council. So how this is going to work? And I don't have all the solutions as a young person. And you'll never find alone, but you can work with other fellow young people, connect with them. Through Young Mediterranean Voices, for example, I learned that also as a young person, we have different perspectives, because I was advocating to create a protection mechanism for peace builders around the Euro-Mediterranean. I'm not going to mention for each country is because I know that this is a risk. You can't enter the country if you talk bad about the country. I know it because of a personal experience with a journalist that wrote some articles about the country and was denied the entrance in this country. So I'm going to be general, and for this reason I'm not going to mention it. But when it comes to perspective of young people, I was seeing like to create this protection mechanism. My colleague from Libya, he said something really interesting. He said, we as young people are asked to fight the wars, but we don't sit in the table of the peace process. So that's something that I would like to take into consideration when we advocate for the youth peace and security agenda, to make sure that young people are sitting in the table. I have advocated quite a lot. I have talked a lot with high-level officials, like with President of Republics, ministers, MPs around the Euro-Mediterranean, being a speaker or a moderator. But at some point, I just don't want to talk with them. I want to become like a policymaker at some point. So I want to see more young people being on the other side of the table, being like policymaker, not just sitting on the table, being themselves policymaker and taking decisions. So this is how I see it. Yes, I hope I was like in 7 minutes. Perfect. Okay. 7.5. Even more? 7.5.
Thank you, Marjus, for bringing your perspectives as a young activist and bringing the centrality of the youth peace and security agenda, which is often not very well known. So I hope people have questions, and I have one for later. Thank you for that. So now our second speaker will be Serge STROOBANTS, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Marjus, for a perfect introduction with your definition of negative and positive peace. Makes me save about 30 seconds of my presentation. I mean, I've been asked to talk about, the future of peace in Europe, or at least is Europe going to be a peaceful continent in the near future? So I will try to answer this in 7 minutes and articulate around 3 major issues. First of all, I will act in my position or in my quality as one of the directors at the Institute for Economics and Peace. So I will overload you with statistics, figures, and the result of our indexes. And then I will flip the coin and look at it from an international security perspective, and basically try to analyze the world in which we live at the moment and the position the EU needs to take to this world, and also the new conditions of this world will basically a weakened position for Europe compared to a much more vocal global south. So starting from the IP perspective, when we look at the levels of peacefulness today in Europe, so when we refer to the latest Global Peace Index, this is the Global Peace Index, which was at the lowest level since the creation of the Peace Index. So in 15 years, last year we were at the lowest level. We had a decrease by 3% over 15 years. And you can imagine that the next one, which is going to be published on the 28th of January, is going to be even worse. So we only decrease the levels of peacefulness globally. What we also do is watch a change in trend. Change in trend, basically looking at the motor for this decrease in peacefulness. Well, in the past decade, clearly conflict. Conflict was the motor of a decrease in peacefulness in the past decade. Since 2-3 years now, so even before the Ukrainian conflict, since 2-3 years, we see a trend change towards high levels of militarization. So the motor of these high levels of militarization, and we are talking about more than 100 countries worldwide who's reinvested into more into their defense, has been generated by the shift towards a new world order, or at least the struggle to change to a new world order. Conflicts or crises like COVID or even the war in Ukraine has just aggravated this change in trend. So clearly, when we look at the future, we are looking at a Europe in which there is a conflict which will stay for a number of years. We are looking at Europe which will continue to have destabilization on its eastern border. And one, from an international security perspective, could really question the fact if it's really a good idea to have Sweden and Finland joining NATO. On the short term, this might bring more security, but definitely on the mid and long term, this is ensured tensions and destabilization on the eastern side of Europe. If we like it or not, from a European perspective, when we look to the east, We of course talk about enlargement, and we of course talk about, at least on our continent, self-determination of people. And if you look at it from the Russian perspective, you clearly look at it from a perspective which is unacceptable for them. We don't like to talk about spheres of influence. We don't like to talk about buffer zones. This is not our European approach to international relations. But if you like it or not, there's a counterpart on the other side who likes those spheres of influence and who like the buffer zone. And every time we push the button in the buffer zone, in Georgia 2008, a couple of years later in Transnistria and Moldova, 2014 Ukraine, well, we saw the reaction, some form of frozen conflict, some form of intervention from Russia defending the last tiny buffer zone that's still at its western border. So that's why in this approach and what's happening in Ukraine today, we might ask ourselves, it's a really good idea to have Finland as first joining NATO in the future. Few more figures. So that's negative peace. So that's the situation where we are at the moment. Europe is still the most peaceful region of the world. Good. But still the levels are decreasing, both in negative peace and positive peace. Positive peace, we have seen an increase of positive peace over the past decade, 2.4%. But still Europe at the status quo, and on 4 out of the 8 pillars of positive peace, we saw a decrease clearly there also. This is explaining to us that it's so easy to destroy peace. It's so easy to fall into the violence trap. And on the indexes, this goes sometimes with double-figure digits, 10, 15, 20% per year. But you can only build very slowly peace, 0.1, 0.2, 0.5% per year also. So the work you do to build peace is much longer than the work, I would say, the crisis you need to destroy peace as such. So we have the most peaceful region of the world, but in decline. And we are surrounded by the least peaceful regions of the world, going from now I would say Eurasia, Russia and Eurasia, followed by the Middle East, North Africa, and of course Sub-Saharan Africa, with a concentration in the Sahel, the epicenter of terrorism, really the epicenter of ecological degradation and impact of climate change, also linked to climate security. So clearly there, it's impossible to conceive a peaceful Europe without peace in its periphery. So that's the first approach. More figures. Cost of violence. Cost of violence annually, of course, this is a statistical estimation. You might want to double this, or maybe do 2.5 times the figure that I'm going to give you now. So last year we estimated that we invested $16.5 trillion in violence. This is 11% of the world GDP. And this is only going to grow, because when NATO says we increase to 2% for everybody, it's basically a 7% increase of the defense budget for NATO. This year, European countries increased by 13.6% their defense investment. All right. So this is only going to confirm the change of trend we are now seeing for 2-3 years. And we are only going to increase the cost of violence. And we are only going to decrease the levels of peacefulness. So that's the situation as it is. 11% of the world GDP, well, take 1% of this, 1% of those 16.5 trillion, that's the equivalent of the global budget for overseas development aid. So I think it's a political decision. Where do you put your money? Do you put your money in violence, or do you put your money in development? 10% of the cost of violence equals the global budget for foreign direct investment. All right? So do you put your money in the economy, or do you put your money in violence? When you look at this figure, 16.5 trillion, you see that about 80% is dedicated to violence containment. So the military around 40, internal defense, basically police, paramilitary or national guards, 30%, and a growing number of percents for private military security companies. So basically the Wagners of this world. So we see 80% is really investing in violence containment. So what we say at the Institute for Economics and Peace is invest in positive peace, invest in those attitudes, structures, and institutions which create peaceful societies, because from there you will have these economic benefits coming along, and many more benefits coming along with a more peaceful situation. So that's the plan. So we are not in a good place at the moment. The perspectives are not really positive. And so basically, what do we need to do about this? Take political decisions. So a bit of the figures from the Institute for Economics and Peace. Now, in which world do we live at the moment? I think, this change in trend to more militarization is linked to the fact that today we live in a world which we could call realist offensive in terms of international relations. So we shifted from a liberal world dominated by the West towards a realist world, or offensive realist world, with not such a dominance created by the West, and with much more vocal global South and much more vocal, I would say, vocal and really interesting competitors in the system. So we shifted from a system where the individual was central and peace was central into the system, into a system today where peace is not central anymore. It's a nice to have, but it's really the protection of your state, you know, your territory, your population, your system. The use of the military is allowed in that system also, and of course, peace is not at the heart of the system anymore. A realist system is also a system in which international organizations as such are not central anymore. I mean, we have seen over the past 2-3 years, first thing which the Russian or the Chinese would drop would be international law. Some positions, if they cannot use that in their zero-sum game of in a realist approach, they would clearly drop some international organizations and definitely will walk out of treaties. I think that the Russians have shown us in the past year. So that's the reality in which we live at the moment: multipolar, multi-layered, and really a realist world. So also at the Institute for Economics and Peace, we had this discussion. We're still having this discussion about the role we can play in a world in which peace is not central anymore. But if you like it or not, that's the reality of today. And so if you come up with strategies, if you come up with answers to potential crises, it needs to be adapted to the reality. And this is where I see a potential danger for Europe, or at least the EU, is to not accept the world in which you live, because automatically, almost theoretically, if you agree with those terms, if you agree with the new world, well, you also agree with your obsolescence. Because if you live in a world where international organizations are not really central anymore and are not really having a positive role, you automatically recognize that you are not really necessary in this type of world. Which implications will that have, or what do I see? I see, of course, continued and permanent influence from the competitors on the ground. I mean, we can take a million of examples only in the past 2-3 months. You know, shifting to another currency as the basis for the economic transactions worldwide, creating of new coalitions, the re-emergence of the BRICS. We spoke about this morning. So those are all I would say features. Those are all characteristics of the new world in which we live, and of course this decreased dominance of the Western presence. So, if you like it or not, that's the world in which we live. So, as a European Union, you need to accept at some point the new world. You need to identify the threats to which you are exposed, and you also need to basically do a strategic security analysis. So, this would allow you at some point to come up with the right doctrines, transformed in strategies, transformed in concepts, and eventually identify the capabilities you need to answer those threats. What do I see today, especially from EU or European perspective? We just invest in capabilities and we don't really know what we are going to buy, why we need that, and what we are going to do with this. I think one of the speakers this morning said, well, there's a huge investment in hardware. Yeah, for what? Because we have one type of conflict in Ukraine, but when you look at the full security analysis and the palette of threats we are facing, we need to invest in much more than the hardware. We need to invest in much more than just, you know, frigates, submarines, fighter jets, and or main battle tanks, which were at the heart of the discussion in Ukraine. Clearly, that's one type of conflict, but the main threat we are facing at the moment as a union or as a continent comes in a multi-morph and much more diversified form. So we need to invest in much more than this. We did not do the security analysis. We do not have a clear strategy. And we are not prepared. I mean, we are not being prepared in the EU for any of the crises of the past 10 years, not for the economic crisis, not for terrorism, which hit us, not for COVID, and definitely not for the war in Ukraine. So therefore, if you do not have any contingency plan, if you're not prepared to the reality of the world, if you disregard the reality in which you live, well, you always come late, you always come second, and you always need to rediscover yourself as a security actor in a time frame of a weekend, which happened last year in late February or early March. Unprepared, no contingency plan. So every decision you would take in this weekend will always be wrong decisions, with no idea of the long-term impact of those decisions and the long-term impact on the stability of your region and eventually also in peace in your region. And we have seen now that we are in a situation, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine, where we have harmed ourselves with the economic sanctions we have imposed. We have no strategy, so the only strategy we follow is the American one. And for those who really have studied the conflict over there, I think I can say it's a conflict between the United States and Russia happening in Europe, where we as Europeans don't really have leverage. First of all, we were not part of the discussions before the war. We are somehow not really part of the discussions during the war. When you look at the power game happening on our continent, we're not really an actor. We're not really the first actor on our own continent. So that's something we need to realize. And for those who are interested, we'll make the analysis and try to define the levels of power the EU is still capable of developing. Level of power meaning level capacity to influence other actors. Just have a look at the travel trip of Zelensky over the past months, and you will realize what our position is when you look at this. The last point, Global South, double language, double standards, that's over. You know, when I travel to the Sahel, I emphasize, and I'm proud of my Belgian-French accent, but I emphasize this accent because then people continue to talk to me. If they would identify me as a French, they would stop talking to me. They would stop talking to me. There is a reality in the world outside of Europe also, which we need to understand. So we can talk about migration in Europe. We can talk about energy crisis in Europe. We can talk about confrontation of major powers. Well, that's the reality in which we live. We lost a lot of credibility. We lost a lot of influence in the rest of the world. That's gone. The voids are filled by other countries really influencing us. And of course, when you see all the African countries, and I'm going to finish because I see you're looking at me. If we look at all those...
You said everything I wanted to say.
Oh, sorry for that.
I don't know what to say.
Oh, I can go on for another 10 minutes then. So basically, when you look at, at the Global South, of course, a lot of countries are becoming more vocal. Why? Because a couple of people are just whispering in their ears what they need to say. So the competition is on. If you like it or not, the competition is on. If you do not adapt to the system in which you live, you're going to disappear. And so if you would ask me in a private discussion what I think about the European Union in the current world, I would say look for another job, because I'm not sure this thing is going to exist in 5 to 10 years from now, because it's obsolete. And why would we need it with the external pressures and the internal dissonances, which we already start to see when we see two of the two leaders of Europe running to Beijing, trying to save their own economy. So what is going to happen inside, or what is going to happen on the outside? And we hear the Global South asking us to receive more dignity, to receive more respect, and to be treated eye to eye in diplomatic terms. We made mistakes in the past. We made mistakes in the past 20 to 30 years. And my previous career was in the military. So in the past 30 years, and especially in 20 years, when I was really actively deploying a lot of troops and deploying a lot of small teams also all over the world, where were the successes? What did we do right in the 20, 30 years? Which legal justification did we use to run all those operations worldwide? What are the successes today, and how did we help create the world in which we live today? I think those are questions we need to ask ourselves to realize that we basically created a lot of the problems we are facing today, because we really had this dominant, arrogant position. We did not do the correct strategic security analysis, and we do not adapt to the environment in which we live. So it's not only in the figures of the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is of course measuring the impact, but it's definitely also in the attitudes which you need to put in place. And when you look, that's the last sentence. And when you look at the only domain which is decreasing in positive peace, what is the attitudes domain? So clearly this is where we need to put the priority. We need to react, and we need to start to do a proper job in an environment in which we recognize. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Serge, for these very enlightening remarks, telling us about many messages and very provocative questions as well on the trends that we need to monitor. And you ask a question which, well, several, but one is how can we build a peaceful Europe without building peace in our surroundings, in the peripheries? And I think this is a question that Alessandra could elaborate and pick up on, because, well, I wouldn't say that Serge said everything you have to say, but we see some convergences on this topic. So I leave it at that, and I give you the floor, Alessandra. I'm sure you have a lot to share as well.
I enter the space with great humility after such an enlightened speech from both of you. But allow me, peace is not at the center, but I would say mankind is not at the center. People, especially the ones I've been dealing with for 30 years during my career, I was inside the movement, but not a movement by choice. I'm going to go there because I'm going to visit friends, or I'm going to go there because I want a better future. No, it's what we call coercive movement, forced movement, and it's the life of internally displaced people or refugees. Let us never forget, please, when we analyze a conflict, or we talk about peace, or we talk about geopolitical, let's never forget to put at the center of our discussion and reflection the real victims of all of this. Today, in the world, we have over 1 million people that are suspended. And I use the word suspended because that's how you feel. You are uprooted. You are no longer part of the right to be a citizen. This is the dramaticity of what we're going through. Why? Because there is no peace. I've analyzed conflict throughout my career. I've been in the most important ones, I have to say, that have formed my also thinking of what peace is and what peace is not, and what is missing so that peace becomes peace. From the former Yugoslavia to the genocide in Rwanda, to the war of a few months in Georgia, through Yemen, through Somalia, through the never-ending Afghanistan. The victims are the same. The actors change, but the victims are the same. So I would like to bring this perspective, especially for the students, because that's how I try and build peace. Many people ask me, but what is your job? In the UN or in UNHCR. And I always replied with this sentence, which I think has a lot of value today, which is, I'd like to think of my job, of the job of many colleagues, of the job of the humanitarians as being a generator of space. Generator of space, and to fill that space of sense and meaning in when around you you're surrounded by the nonsense, by the absence of sense and by the absence of hope. Now, generating space, it's not an easy thing, especially in the work of people, of NGOs and international organizations that are working for refugees. The first space you generate is the right to stay, is to negotiate and mediate the borders to remain open. And while we are talking here, there are appeals at all levels requesting the neighboring countries of Sudan to keep their borders open, because that is the first protection that you can give. Now, peace in Europe. We are all interconnected. The world is globalized, although at the center there is something else, and I think Serge said it very well. Mankind is marginalized for several reasons, and we have difficulties to bring really the person, mankind, again at the center of the stage, for various reasons that can be a debate among students later on. The fact that solidarity has not become a political value anymore, and the fact that the mere fact of generating a human gesture of welcoming has been criminalized is a problem today. The fact that Europe looks at the rest of the world as imposing the rest of the world to become a container of human beings. The fact that Europe is influenced by a process of defending itself from whom? From the aliens coming from Mars? No, by the same mere mankind. But this has changed dramatically because it has become a political agenda. I have been always fighting as a humanitarian that there are certain issues that you cannot politicize, and that is human crisis. In front of a human crisis, you stay quiet and you implement the compass to solve it, which is solidarity. Not my words, Rodotà. Not my words, Rodotà, is that we are afraid to use solidarity as the compass to solve a crisis. Now, I have tried to use it. I was in the former Yugoslavia, Operation Storm, August 1995. I was in the Serb area of the Krajina. I was near Topusko. We are informed that the Croatian army is marching in, and it's marching in through the artillery that is coming in, and we could hear it flying on top of my house. We evacuate, we go into the UN quarters, we stay put. At a certain point, we have over, I think I saw at least 50, 60,000, even 100,000 people fleeing and coming around the UN headquarters, because for them it was the magical space of hope and release. I was with 3 staff members, the UN beret was there, and there was an incredible prophetic Ukraine commander who said, you come with me, you represent the humanitarian world, you come with me, we go solve this problem, we go negotiate a ceasefire at Glina, in the middle of nowhere. Generating a space of dialogue and mediation in the middle of chaos, was the hugest challenge that, among other experiences, formed my understanding of the value to be innovative, creative, get out of the comfort zone and put in circle the human DNA in front of the crisis. Well, to cut the story short, we are there. It was my turn to talk to General Stipovic. I say the names because this is history. And I said, General Stipovic, I have nothing else to say, that if you advance, I saw the men, they were ready, all with the black faces, they were ready for the infantry to come in, because for a few days the artillery paved the way in. General Stipovic, if you move, you will find women, pregnant women, elderly, wounded, everything. General Stipovic talks to the general of the UN and says, why do you bring women at the front line? And he says, if you bring me the Serb counterpart, I will not move in. The space for mediation was open. Through what? Through bringing the reality of what it is that impacts human lives. So when we talk about security, when we talk about all of these very important issues, militarization, I think it is important always to have a group of people that are capable to generate and to open that space. The result was the corridor to all the way up to Lipovac, over 100,000 Serbs that moved in there. And you won't imagine, just a few months ago, when I met the daughter of a family who is studying now in Italy, and when I shared this story, she said, my parents were in that corridor. And for me, it was like, wow, incredible. That's the saving lives. I conclude by saying that for the humanitarians, and here I talk to the students on the role of the humanitarians in chaos, because we have a role to play. It's not just giving out biscuits and blankets. It's not just being kind and good. We shape by bringing in and influencing. 2 other examples, the World Bank. The World Bank, well, also with Europe. Let's look at Europe and the Sahel, because that's where I was for the past 4 years in Niger. At the center of this triangle called the Liptogoruma. Here comes Europe imposing their vision on migration to this part of the Sahel. asking the Sahel to criminalize, like they do in Europe, every irregular movement. It impacted so much that the Schengen, the CEDEAO, the ECOWAS is impacted, where citizens of ECOWAS, every time they move, they are stopped, asking, where do you go? Are you a future candidate through Agadez to Libya? Impacted. The criminalization of freedom of movement. This is a very strong theme. In Niger, and I would launch this idea with the government, which is quite enlightened, I would say, in the middle of that chaos. I have a personal, very constructive relation with President Bazoum. And the idea is, why don't we make Africa the think tank of migration? Why don't we talk to Europe on what migration is? Why don't we influence? Why don't we educate? We can, because Africa hosts 45 million refugees and internally displaced people compared to the 2,000 to 3,000 that land in Lampedusa. Africa can, because Africa hosts. They can come up with the lessons learned. My dream is to have a think tank in Africa that really indicates what solidarity, when you generate la gestione, when you managing with care, handling with care, because these issues are fragile. They are fragile because they touch our humanity. I'm sorry if I speak like this. I'm not really conventional, but the experience that I've made in 30 years of this humanity makes me think like this now. It's the only way out. Yes, security, everything you can. I've been there, we've been dealing. The World Bank, and I conclude here, the role of the humanitarians is to influence, by coming out of the comfort zone and being creative, these organizations to come and mainstream in your issue. The nexus that we were talking yesterday morning. The nexus, I had the privilege with the UN and the UN country team to discuss with the World Bank the possibility for the World Bank to start mainstreaming attention to displacement in their regional planning. That is a success. The World Bank that enters into regional planning for the displaced people. That is a great success. Investing in community-based approaches, allowing the absorption capacity to do what? To absorb. And avoiding conflicts. Well, in Niger, there are no more refugee camps. From the onset of crossing the border, you enter immediately into the development path, which is the community hosting you. But in order for the community to host you, you have to put the community in the condition to host. So this is the example. In the middle of chaos, just imagine the thunders of yesterday, a new little ant with the NGOs and the humanitarian world trying to shape dialogue, ceasefires locally, and trying to shape, well, this, I think, it's not seen by the world, but believe me, it exists every day. So what I'm saying, and I conclude, is that, yes, peace is not at the center, but everything that I believe that the essence and the DNA of peace, I was telling this to Bernardo at lunch, is the capacity to, in Italian we say, di essere tessitori di relazione, meticulous tailor of relationship. We are missing this as well. We are missing this as well. We are delegating, and I conclude, but I'm saying this as an engagement, as a pacifist. We have delegated to embargoes and to arms the capacity to make peace. And we see it. Refugees are not able to return home. That's the thermometer. Look at the thermometer of forced movement and you realize where we're at. A war, a conflict today, it takes 30 years, if, to solve it. Third generation in Kakuma in Dadaab. Third generation. 12 years of war, over 12 in Syria. Passing over 10 years in Yemen. Non-stop incapacity to build and maintain peace. This is the real problem that Europe should also think about and resolve. Why Europe? Because Europe was funded as the guardian and the custodian of peace. I think,
Thank you, Alessandra.
yeah.
Thank you,
Compliment each
Thank you,
other.
Alessandra, for these words speaking from your heart, from your experiences. I think you brought us back to this human dimension, and I think there are some connecting thoughts between the three of you. When you talk about solidarity as a value that shapes political decisions, Serge, you talk about the choices you make when you invest. Those choices in investment are guided by values, and you talk about attitudes building, and Marjus also talked about all this connecting young people from different parts in dialogue, and that's attitude shaping. And one of the things we see in research in peace education is that a lot of children are having difficulties being empathic. And so many schools in Europe are now experimenting with how to become more human, more empathic. So it's bringing back to this human dimension. Very rich discussions, but I'd like to open the floor because I think the three interventions have been very, very mobilizing. So I open the floor for questions or comments. Yeah. So I see a lady and then.
Speaking from
Fantastic. Could you introduce
My name
yourself?
is-
Say your name.
yes.
Yes. Thank you.
My name is Marianella Sclavi, and on art of creative conflict years now. And I agree completely with your analysis of the three of you about the fact that we really need an European Union more effective, more capable of dealing with conflicts inside the European continent and in the world. And you cannot have peace unless if you have all the places around deal with the big conflicts, as you said. Worked. I know.
I have that.
Like all of you do, even a small, which is not very important, but that you feel that that was
I'll take two more questions. I saw. Yeah. I saw somebody. Yeah. Go ahead then. Yes.
This is a question to Serge mainly, but others might want to comment. Not a very pessimistic view of institutions, but of international institutions as a kind of architecture for peace. But I think that there's also other signs under the Ukraine situation which say to me, at least, that most countries are fundamentally interested in the present infrastructure for peace. And I would look at the General Assembly votes mainly for that. So you've said about European influence, forget it. I mean, is this what you're also saying about international institutions? We need to start thinking about something else? Or to what extent would you agree in what I say, that there's plenty of signs that there's one that there's one kind of delinquent country which has gone against the international system. It's got a few allies which are also outside, but not direct. But the vast majority of countries still want this system to be preserved.
And then we'll take a third question with you. If you can also say your name and your affiliation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Jana Im, and I'm a former member of the Italian Parliament and member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I thank you very much for your really thoughtful insight and also being very somehow realpolitik by showing on how the reality is right now and not going a bit beyond, let's say, diplomacy in these terms. I want to argue about the last point, which was mentioned about, let's say, how somehow giving the arms and this solution of violence and arm, the solution on how to solve and how to get peace. So very often we hear the sentence of if we bring victory, if we gain something, then we will arrive. And we already know, but sometimes the people are not willing to understand that history has shown that arms and violence will never bring to real peace, but rather than violence. My point, my question here, since we are also in university and since the world which we are having right now in the present and in the near future is somewhat, in a pessimistic way, a world which is falling apart and a world which has to be somehow restructured, reseen. The question and the future generations the responsibility, but also the tools on how to shape this world in a better world. And I want to say this also in a provocative way, because I very often see that in words the youth and somehow the next generations are seen as the leaders to act in, but then in reality they are very often beyond closed doors in terms of taking responsibility and acting. Thank you.
So we'll take the reverse order, starting with Alessandra, Serge, Marjus. I think the questions, although there are some questions directed specifically for some of you, I think they're relevant for the three of you.
Well, no, thank you for allowing me to start. I will reply to Marinella. First of all, let me say that Marinella is very humble sitting behind there, but she's one of my gurus. She doesn't know, but I read a lot about her and what she says. She's an expert on really how of the art of listening, and I think that everything is falling apart because of we are missing the opportunity to create the conversational spazi conversativi, as she calls them. So, the next step is bombs falling out of the window. That is, no? But I would like to say one example, okay, of this space where we bring people together. Basically, this space that I call, they are space where the fears comes together. We are human beings. We act because we are afraid. And we have to protect our borders, our identity. We don't want to mix, we don't want to contaminate. We create enemies just because they're different from us. Me first, you later, you maybe not. You can enter, maybe yes, maybe not. So these spaces of where fears come together and embrace themselves and go through experience of alterity, of the otherness, is what education to peace means. So I was in Niger with a situation. One day they call me and they from my office in Agadez, and they say there are 2,000 Sudanese that are walking downstream. They are coming from Libya to Niger. I said, wow, this is a new movement. Mainly they tend to go through the Mediterranean to Europe. Now what? We have people coming to Niger? Because remember, people go where there is protection. We go naturally where there is protection. I feel protection is there, I move there. So it's an instinct to survive. I am called immediately by the Minister of Interior, who is now the president, and he says, Morelli, you have 10 days to solve this problem. I don't want Sudanese in my country. They have to go. They return to Libya. Because the Sudanese within Africa, you must understand, many are stigmatized because linked to mercenary, terrorism, supporting in Libya, etc., etc. The Guardian wrote about the Sudanese, the lost generation of boys, because they're everywhere. They're searching for themselves everywhere. And with Sudan now, even more. So I had an issue there. I cannot push people back and go against my mandate. So I said we have to open a space of tolerance, first of all. So that's what we did. I said, Minister, give me 10 days, but I need to enter into dialogue. So I'm not going to go into details, but basically we moved from a space of tolerance to the humanitarian space, because I had no access to these people. I could not give them even a glass of water so that they could be dispersed. Tolerance, humanitarian space, asylum space, space for solutions. This was done respecting the local tribes. This was done talking to the local people, but was done through creating a space, uno spazio di ascolto ascetico, profound listening, and coming together and understanding the fears and trying to manage fear. The Sudanese are still there. Many, there is intermarriages. Many came to Italy through the corridors. Many are resettled to Canada and the States. This because that's a positive example on how space for dialogue and listening and uniting fears generates something new. Last one is, my answer to you is very easy. We are at a crossroad. We cannot stay indifferent. Humanity and dishumanity, that's the crossroad. One has to choose where to be and fight.
Thank you, Alessandra.
All right, to take the questions in the order, what works? Of course, I have to say positive peace and positive peace workshops and training, which we are doing. A bit of theory, so where we are at the moment, so it's a systemic approach to peace and the creation of peaceful societies. So where we are at the moment has been defined by the past, so there's path dependency. Where we go from here, you can influence this. You can either create your positive feedback loops or your negative feedback loops. Basically create virtuous cycles or vicious cycles. The virtuous cycles are those where you have high levels of positive peace, therefore lower levels of grievances, which can be mediated and negotiated. You don't need to invest in violence to contain violence. That's money you can reinvest into your positive peace. That's the virtuous cycle. You can imagine what the vicious cycle is. It's completely different. So that's what we want to achieve. And in there, and I come with you, that's the vision of mission of the Institute, is to give every human being the potential to flourish completely. All right. So that's what we want to achieve. And it's a paradigm shift we want to achieve, and turning something which could be fluffy, talk about peace, in something which is measurable, quantifiable, and therefore activable also. I mean, I don't know if this is an English word, but I just invented it, right? So activable. So you can change and you can steer towards a more peaceful society. To give an example of this, Peace 911 in the Philippines, before COVID, we were active over there, and we really go from Mindanao to Paquitibao, something like this, which is a district, and then Davao, which is a city. We train positive peace, of course, in coordination with the other organization, after a period of 9 months, insurgency-free or insurgent-free zone. The governor of Mindanao was back in Sara Duterte. She's now vice president of the Philippines. We have been invited to do for the entire country. So we already trained 600 senior officers, law enforcement, security forces, and from there we want to trickle down into the entire country. It's working if, as I said before, you make the political choice to choose for that option. So clearly that's the IEP answer to your question. The second question, I think, when you look at it again from a theoretical perspective, and you look at the illiberal world, you need those international organizations to organize peace, to organize the interconnections, and to basically organize an environment in which all the actors can live together and basically manage peace also. And even in the liberal approach, you need to read Kant's last chapter, which is talking about protecting with military assets your system, because not the entire system is going to be liberal. So we are still in a transition. So clearly, people still stick to the old system, and some are evolving to the new system. What I also see is a realist approach to the existence of international organizations, and using and abusing international organizations as a tool for your influence. Look at the number of Russian and Chinese director level within the EU institutions. This has been built up over the past 20 years. And I'm using the term past 20 years because we need to get back to 1999 to find a Chinese concept of unrestricted warfare, which is basically a warfare of a smaller, I would say, smaller power towards a more influential, a stronger power. Basically, two military candidates where one is stronger than the other. 1999, 2 years later, start to implement. We are facing now the results of a perfect implementation of a doctrine, if you like it or not. So that's why I say, look at the world, look at reality. So yes, we still cling to what's existing, and it has proven to be successful at some point. But we need to be very careful not for those tools to become tools in a realist approach in international relations. I'm also with you. I mean, you spoke about the vote at UNGA. I'm with you. But I found it quite awkward from a Western perspective which is against spheres of influence, which is against good or bad. Well, when you organize a vote like this at UNGA, you're basically organizing who is with me and who is against me. So you're creating those two sides. By doing so at the UNGA, you basically destroyed the capacity for peace negotiation, because who is going to organize this today? We had some in Turkey before we did the mistake. The Americans said, like, oh, we don't want peace at the moment. Right? Which country in the world today, now that we have the two blocks, which countries are going to organize peace talks for Ukraine? An African country, maybe you can.
No, the Vatican.
Or the Vatican, maybe, yeah.
But we are part of the conflict.
It is. So I'm absolutely right. Everybody's part of the conflict today, because we had to choose sides because of the vote of the UNGA. So the institutions are still there, but you need very careful. You need really to have a more systemic approach and understand the effects and the results of your actions. I think, and I'm turning to the students also. I'm the old wild male here. I understand it, So I'm still thinking about constructivism and realism and liberalism and neo forms of this and whatever you want to combine with offensive, defensive. It's up to you guys to come up with new ideas. It's up to you guys to redefine international relations, maybe in the future, where you could have kind of a liberal system strong enough to survive into a realist environment. Really reading Kant's last chapter about protecting your own system. So we might evolve towards a situation where you would have a group of countries which will be under pressure anyhow, still organizing themselves in a liberal way, the golden billion, the West, and then the rest of the world. What I'm seeing at the moment is like you need to choose sides. Alliances are being made. So we'll see what's going to come out of this. Your point, it's an excellent point. I think, if you would look at my office in Brussels, the second oldest just left. She turned 30. She worked 4 years for me. She's moving on to the headquarters in Sydney. She's becoming director of partnership. There you go. Perfect deputy for 4 years. I'm still crying every evening because she left me, But she moved on to something better and bigger. All the rest, 24, 25 interns, whatever you want to call it, right? I think it's a choice there also. Either you trust youth or you don't trust youth. Either you invest in youth or you do not invest in youth. So for those who want to have an internship, come and see me afterwards, right? So it's a political choice. It's a certain approach. What I see, again, as old white male, I could say, the woke generation, oh my God, what's going on? No. What I see is there also some form of polarization where, of course, you have those crazy ideas about how society should be organized. Well, good luck and for your survival. But I see a huge group of very talented, very, I would say, focused young people who come with solutions, who gather and would try to be vocal and listen to them, because usually you will find solutions. And when we train people in positive peace, the two main targets would be youth and women. Youth, because it's a bulge of the population, especially in those regions in which we are active. And when you look at Africa, It's going to double the population next 30 years. So we will talk to a lot of young people in the next 30 years. And women, why? Because they are peace builders and they are reaching out to many more people in their communities than men would ever do. So clearly, in the work that you do, you need to target those people. You need to empower also those people. And then it's a political human resource choices to give a chance to young people. On the other hand, we know that I recruited, I just ask for like a normal master's degree, 5 years of experience, and out of the 100 candidates I received, I had 60 PhDs, for example, who turn 35 and more. So the market is a little bit disrupted also, and you are really in competition with these incredible masters. But there again, it's not going to PhD who is going to get the job, So that, yeah, I mean, the market is what it is, but it's always your own choice. You make your own choice to make sure that you can invest in the right people.
Mainstream the human dimension always.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. And I give the floor to Marjus. And I think it's an example of how creative youth-led networks have been in providing solutions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that I have the most difficult part now because we are already out of time and they have covered quite almost everything. So, but first of all, I wanted to make also some comments on what was said before, like what does work, and what doesn't work. I can tell you, for example, that doesn't work the mentality of the Western Balkans during the 90s, like the ethnocentrism, the nationalism, like my population is better than the other one. But they are making progress. They are moving forward from nationalism to patriotic. So it's getting on the way. And what doesn't work, for example, also a country that works alone on an agenda. We talked about like decreasing military expenditures. Can Italy work alone on it? It cannot. Can Europe work alone on it? It cannot. Can they decrease military expenditures? They can, but they're not going to do it. You are not going to convince policymakers. I'm going to say this because of the security dilemma. If my neighbor is going to increase military expenditures, why should I decrease them? I don't feel safe. So, for sure, the solution doesn't come alone, doesn't come from a country, doesn't come from a region, but it comes together. We have the spaces. We have the United Nations Security Council. We have the General Assembly at the UN. So, my idea is that there are some opinions that say to remove some countries from the Security Council or the General Assembly, it won't bring a solution. Because we need space for dialogue. Not just for young people, because my thoughts should be on young people, but in general, we need those spaces to stick together, to come together and discuss. And so I think the solution doesn't come alone. It will never come alone. We have to work at international level if we want to keep societies being more peaceful. And when it comes like, what is the solution? It's really difficult to bring the solution on something like this in such a wide topic with an interconnected world with 195 countries that are part of the UN and another 10, 15 that are not part of it. The world is too complex to give like a solution like that. We have little solutions. My parents were used to say me with little bricks, you can build a castle. And so with little programs, but done widely, we can for sure keep societies more civil. We need to fund civil society organizations. We need to increase the fundings of civil society organizations. I see how they are suffering in Europe, in Italy especially. Especially youth civil society organizations. I have co-founded a young NGO, a youth NGO that works on peace building, and I see how problematic it is to get funds and so to keep the organization working on these topics. I see how difficult is participation. I am lucky, I consider myself lucky because I was part of leadership programs, so I had the network. I could include myself in summits, and so it was easier for me. But can everyone get this kind of opportunities? I don't see it. I didn't see so many young people getting this kind of opportunities. So when it comes to the solution, I mentioned before some programs, for example, the Young Mediterranean Voice, that are bringing together the youth from North Africa, Middle East, and Europe to discuss, to dialogue, and to develop leadership skills together with policymakers around the Euro-Med region. But who can be the mediator of this kind of program? In that case, we were lucky because we had an intergovernmental organization that were doing it. We need institutions to be part of this kind of solutions. They cannot come alone, like from civil society organization. Civil society organization can be part of the solution, but not the solution alone. And young movements are the only movements that can change the world. Youth have the power to change the world in positive. And from what I see, when I talk like with my colleagues that are not living in Europe, they see Europe as a symbol of peace and as a symbol of hope. We don't know how lucky we are here in Europe compared to other people. And so we should use this power that we have, that we are a symbol of hope and a symbol of peace. Europe itself can be a mediator on this kind of issues and this kind of problems because of the reputation that Europe has. I don't know if Serge before meant that Europe is not going to be like this in the future and maybe...
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, okay. I'm working on this opposite direction because I'm also a political activist. I'm trying to build a federal Europe. So I manage all the time like national elections, I'm going to manage European elections, and I'm going to work on the opposite direction of Serge. And I'm doing it with young people. So to put the young people at the center, to be the policymakers, and to be the one that can really change the present and the future. I always hear like this kind of sentence that say, young people are the future. I don't want to be the future. My parents always teach me, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I want to live today, and I want to be the present, and from the present and to change. When it comes to the future, I don't think that Europe is going to be, when you talk about youth movements, I don't think Europe is going to be the center. 40% of the young people within 2050 will be living in Africa. They are going to be the future, not Europe anymore. We have to think about this, changing this paradigm shift. So we are not the center anymore when we talk about the young people. Let me stop here because I think I took a bit too much. Okay.
Thank you
perfect.
so much,
You're welcome.
Marjus. I'm really sorry I have to. Yes, someone's. Okay, I think we need to wrap up. Thank you so much. But there's so many issues. Use the coffee break. Use the spaces to follow up. These conferences are spaces where we put our fears together, and we create spaces for imagining solutions. I thank the speakers. I thank the audience for the questions.